person, but I'm happy to talk with you nonetheless. The aim of this talk today is really to throw some material for discussion. I'm still working on the topic, and I think it relates well to your format because it's about a series of issues that emerge from the sort of prehistory of what is known today as relativized a priori. These issues both emerge historically from the debates I'm going to consider, and they are still quite largely discussed in the literature. The direction of research I'm going to focus on is known as the relativization of the Kantian a priori. And it can be defined as a philosophical line of argument that goes back to the late 19th century attempts to reconcile classical German-speaking philosophy with scientific developments using resources from Kant's philosophy. Kant himself, this is justified by the fact that Kant himself described the lasting insights of his philosophy as the discovery of a specific kind of synthetic a priori knowledge that is independent of experience because it provides the preconditions for the possibility of an experience in general. And the relativization of the Kantian a priori comes with the recognition that a priori elements, specifically those established by Kant, cannot be fixed once and for all, but may vary in scientific change. And there are typical examples of this appeared only after Kant and include non-Euclidean geometry, the rigorization of real analysis, and the revolutions of 19th century physics. In short, the view can be summarized, is usually summarized, paraphrasing Reichenbach, by saying that the meaning of a priori knowledge as constituting the concept of object by providing preconditions for the possibility of scientific inquiry can be retained without implying another meaning of it as necessarily true and valid for all time, which is supposedly found also in Kant. Now, when looking at the philosophical roots of this view, it can be added that similar strategies were proposed in the Neo-Kantian movement, particularly in the Marburg School, that is obviously also the background for Reichenbach's own account, but also in the Neo-Kantian epistemologies of philosophers, scientists such as Hermann von Helmholtz and Henri Poincaré. And now similar strategies emerged again in more recent philosophy of science, starting with Thomas Kuhn, who declared himself a Kantian with movable categories, Jan Hacking, who used the notion of styles of philosophy as a possible way to rephrase the idea of relativized a priori. And more recently, Michael Friedman and David Stump, who advocated actually different versions of the argument. I'm going to leave this discussion a little bit in the background in this presentation, but as you will see in the concluding part is definitely my objective to engage with these discussions. However, I believe that looking back at the development of the argument, starting really from the Marburg School, would be helpful to counter some of the classical objections that emerge in connection with this line of argument. So I will first offer a brief overview of how the differentiation of the meanings of the a priori, along with the idea of relativization, emerged in Marburg Neo-Kantianism, not only to gain a more comprehensive picture of the origin of this view, but because I believe that reconsidering some of these arguments will help us deal with objections that are still open for debates. So the route I'm going to follow will be to start really with a few remarks on Cohen's reading of Kant, in particular the considerations about the different meanings of a priori in Cohen's reading. And then I'm going to consider Cassirer's functional theory of knowledge as the most direct predecessor to Reichenbach's relativization. And finally, Reichenbach's move to consider these a prioris or constitutive elements without necessity, which I will take now as a sort of line between a notion that is still related to the Kantian notion in its general aims, and a notion that has the problem as the tendency. It's not a problem, of course, if you are a conventionalist, but has the tendency to collapse with the related notion of convention. And then I'm going to consider some of the objections that emerged in the classical debate following the interpretation of general relativity by Reichenbach and Cassirer, but also in the more a recent debate initiated by Friedman in particular. So, as for the interpretation of this notion by Cohen, I will first stress that the peculiarity of Cohen's approach, as is characteristic of the neo-Kantian movement, is to start from Kant exegesis to articulate what they present as an original view, or famously, as the Windelmatt motto suggests, to go beyond Kant by the means of Kant exegesis itself. So in particular, Cohen emphasizes the following characteristic of the Kantian a priori. That we will see lead then to a distinction by Cohen himself that tends to already suggest a relativizing strategy. So a first meaning is taken from Kant's own definition of the concept in terms of necessity and strict universalities that are sure indications of a priori knowledge, because they clearly distinguish it from empirical knowledge. That namely knowledge that can achieve only a subjective or psychological kind of necessity and a comparative kind of generality. So they are distinguishing features, distinguishing marks of the notion, which Kant obviously held as clearly displayed by examples such as geometry and the principles of mathematics and theoretical physics. They belong together insofar as judgment is necessarily true. A judgment is necessarily true if it does not admit any exceptions, and so it is strictly universal or is derived from strictly universal premises. So the two are so related. The second meaning of the a priori, according to Cohen's reading, is the view that a priori knowledge expresses the formal conditions of a possible experience, not in the modern sense of formal, of course, but as opposed to and correlative to the material that is being shaped, constituted, constructed in such a way. This is the kind of language that we find in Kant himself, and specifically in the listed passages, Kant defines space and time as formal conditions of sensibility, introduces further conditions with the categories of the understanding, and generally refers to the system of conditions that are required together to constitute a possible experience. Finally, Kant also distinguishes these constitutive conditions from what he calls the regulative assumptions we make for various subjective reasons, which differ in the case of principles and ideas of reason. These are the relevant passages. So what does Cohen do already in his Kant exegesis? he introduces this distinction, exploiting Kant's characterization of the conditions in general and purely a priori as metaphysical, and the correlative consideration in the context of the transcendental logic transcendental. He introduces this further distinction between the two meanings. So he called metaphysical the notion of a priori as universal and necessary, and therefore distinguished from the psychological structure of the knowing subject. He called transcendental all forms of cognition that contribute to the constitution of the concept of experience. Of course, the two notions are related to each other in Kant's critique. The first are there to make a priori characterized and recognizable, and the second explain the role of it in the constitution of experience. However, Cohen also made way for later relativizing strategies by pointing out that the essential meaning of the a priori is the transcendental one. And it should be clarified that the possible experience that is being constructed coincides with science or scientific experience. This is best shown, according to Cohen, actually not in the structure and the procedure of the critique of reason, but rather in the so-called analytic procedure of the prolegomena, where Kant starts from the synthetic a priori judgments of mathematics and theoretical physics. As I said, Kant takes the a priority of these judgments to be granted, to investigate their a priori sources in reason. Now, as Cohen puts it, experience is given in the historical documented fact of the mathematical science of nature, and the task of the transcendental inquiry is to derive the preconditions for the possibility of this fact, namely synthetic principles, by a sort of analytic procedure along the lines of the prolegomena or regressive analysis. And in Cohen's reading, also the system or formal conditions of a priori culminates in the synthetic principles, and this allowed him to engage with two of the main objections against the Kantian theory of the a priori in the 19th century debate. I'm going to skip over it, but just roughly, the two main objections concerned the assumption of pure intuition as separate faculty of the mind, which Cohen also criticized as a reminder of Kant's reliance on a theory of the faculties of the mind, and which became irrelevant in the account of the formation of mathematical concepts beginning in the 19th century. And the other kind of objections concerned the so-called metaphysical deduction of the categories from the forms of general logic, which had as a consequence the idea of a complete final system of fixed categories. This is also something that Cohen wants to reconsider in the light of his reading. Another passage I wanted to conclude with this part is where Cohen introduces the idea of the relative necessity of the transcendental a priori as referred to contingent experience, and this is something that finds also important support in Kant's text. So he writes, the transcendental method in directing its deductions to the fact of the mathematical science of nature is not taking off from any somehow supposed absolute, but from experience as something completely contingent. According to Kant, the kind of necessity that is tied to what is determined by the given empirical contingency is only a relatively necessary, or rather as a required condition. What is necessary per se is beyond the possibility of experience. So it is a relative notion of necessity. And the point I will try to stress is that the relativizing strategies originating from this reading of Kant stand and fall with the admission, with the assumption of this relative type of necessity with respect to principles of science. I will then turn to Cassirer, starting by stressing that Cassirer offered an original interpretation of the transcendental method in Cohen's sense that departs from his teacher's interpretation in many ways. In particular, Cassirer was, if not the first, arguably the most successful neo-Kantian to take into account the new achievement of mathematical logic. And he did that starting from a somewhat paradoxical claim that there is some sort of convergence between neo-Kantianism and these developments. If one considers the fact that Cohen's interpretation of the principle of transcendental method had been subject to very harsh critiques by the protagonist of the logicist movement, and also considering that Russell, Couturat, and others took the inclusion of theories of mathematics into logic as a way to do without the synthetic a priori in Kant's sense, to replace it with their logical derivation in mathematics more generally. So contradicting the insight that mathematics is distinguished from logic by some sort of synthetic character. So Cassirer started his main epistemological reflection in his early career with a paper where he advocated the view that there is this sort of convergence between Marburg neo-Kantianism and modern mathematical logic, insofar as they both replace the Kantian theory of pure sensibility with the logical derivation of the fundamental principle of mathematics. We've seen that in Cohen's reading of Kant, this amounted to the tendency to verticalize the structure of the critique as starting from the synthetic principles. And according to Cassirer's interpretation, it is justified to talk about logico-mathematical synthesis insofar as mathematics, also the parts that can be reduced to logic, yields the construction of some specific sui generis kinds of objects that are abstract, and provide the model for scientific concept formation in a new type of concept that is distinguished from the general concepts of syllogistic logic, the logic that was known to Kant, because it is incarnate in the mathematical concept of function. The notion of function that Cassirer uses is not that of an arbitrary function, but is more precisely that of a universal law, which by virtue of the successive values which the variable can assume contains within itself all the particular cases for which it holds. And Cassirer contrasted it with the received account of concept formations in syllogistic logic, insofar as this seemed to imply a view according to which the things or substances are supposed to have a determined identity in themselves and to become recognizable by the specification of some characteristic properties. Here, on the contrary, the specification, capability to diversify all the elements is determined by a functional law. And more generally, Cassirer interprets the transcendental method in analogy with the modern way to define geometrical concepts in terms of relative invariance of a transformation group. And with that, I would like to introduce some of the passages where he, in his main work, Substance and Function, his main early epistemological work, then we're going to see a few considerations about how he develops the argument, characterizes the a priori. So he writes, the goal of the critical analysis would be reached if we succeeded in isolating in this way the ultimate common elements of all possible forms of scientific experience. That is, if we succeeded in conceptually defining those moments which persist in the advance from theory to theory because they are the conditions of any theory. He goes on to point out that at no given stage of knowledge, this goal is perfectly achieved, but it should remain as a sort of demand for the evolution of the system of experience. And then he writes, from this point of view, the strictly limited meaning of a priori is clearly evident. Only those ultimate logical invariants can be called a priori, which lie at the basis of any determination of a connection according to natural law. A cognition is called a priori, not in any sense as if it were prior to experience, but because and insofar as it is contained as a necessary premise in every valid judgment concerning facts. And again, here we find expressed this idea of relative necessity, relative to what? To something that is contingent, namely a fact. Cassirer then, in this stage, accounts for object constitution in terms of what can be considered a multi-level system of synthesis that we have seen are supposed to be rooted in logical mathematical reasoning, and involve also several steps in the formation of concepts. This is the way I schematize it. So it starts, this is really almost immediately identical with the definition of function, with the introduction of serial principles determining a multiplicity as an ordered manifold. This is exemplified for Cassirer in the series of numbers and the way to define numbers in terms of progressions by Dedekind. The second step consists in the coordination of different series that have been ordered in this way, and Cassirer here starts with examples internal to mathematics, but especially relating to the problem of finding structural similarities between mathematical objects, also from different disciplines. So typically, another example that is taken from Dedekind is the coordination between the points of a line and the rational numbers that Dedekind used to introduce the idea of points not coordinated with the other system, and so limiting points that can be constructed in terms of classes of rationals corresponding to irrational numbers in his definition of continuity, which actually starts from the connectedness of a line or a linear continuum in modern terminology. Another example that Cassirer takes from projective geometry is the way that one can construct a segment, construct a numerical series on a segment of a projective line, so that this series can be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the real numbers. So these are, first of all, examples taken from mathematics, but what they produce is a way to order mathematical structures that works both in mathematics and physics. So both in mathematics and physics, Cassirer shows example of coordinations of distinct but structurally similar domains, and points to how this leads to a hierarchy of structures governed by coordinating principles. Now, examples of this include the group theoretical treatment of geometry and geometrical physics. In 1910, we are in a pre-relativistic setting, but also the conservation of energy and the program of early 20th century energetics, according to Cassirer, promised to provide a comprehensive coordination of the phenomena in a comparable sense. So in this example, Cassirer suggests object constitution leads to identifying developments in which wide and fruitful fields become accessible to mathematical determination. And this, for Cassirer, is in line with his view that the reality expressed by mathematical symbolism is not that of things, but that of laws and relations, which is a view in this number of passages expressed more or less in the same terms, but relating to very different things. So in Substance and Function, he's talking about the natural numbers in Dedekind's system, but in 1921 he's talking about the use of non-Euclidean geometry in general relativity, and in 1936 he's talking about the lawfulness of phenomena in quantum mechanics. So these are some of the passages where you can find the claim in the book on general relativity. The claim is that the language of non-Euclidean geometry is and remains purely ideal and symbolic, precisely as, rightly understood, the language of Euclidean geometry could only be, and the reason is that the reality which alone it can express is not that of things, but that of laws and relations. And now, he writes, we can ask epistemologically only one question: whether there can be established an exact relation and coordination between the symbols of non-Euclidean geometry and the empirical manifold of spatial-temporal events. And if physics answer this question affirmatively, then epistemology has no ground for answering it negatively. However, he also reconsidered his previous characterization of the a priori of space in a pre-relativistic context, saying that the earlier considerations about which geometry seemed to assume the role of an a priori in physics, they must go a peculiar and paradoxical reversal, so to speak. And then he explains pure Euclidean space stands, as it is now seen, not closer to the demands of empirical and physical knowledge than the non-Euclidean manifolds, but rather more removed, for precisely because it represents the logically simplest form of spatial construction. It is not wholly adequate to the complexity of content and the material determinateness of the empirical. And later, in the work on quantum mechanics, he spells out the account of measurement implied here by saying that actually in classical physics, as generally we have these three types of statements that are related to each other in a functional way. So starting with the closest to observation, we have statements of results of measurement. We have then statements of law that define the terms of the former statements by establishing how physical magnitudes are related according to the theory. And finally, we have statements of principles coordinating the laws with empirical data in a univocal way. What justifies a reversal, and in this sense, the changing a prioris that we have seen in place in his reading of general relativity, is the fact that all of these elements and all of these layers are interrelated. So he writes, all the statements of physics are determined through one another. They mutually condition and support one another, and their specific truth is due precisely to this mutual interconnection. This reciprocal interweaving and bonding constitutes one of the basic features of the system of physics, which therefore there is no proper substantial carrier. Within it, therefore, there is no proper substantial carrier, nothing that per se est per se concipitur. There is only a functional coordination in which all the elements, all the determining factors of physical truth uniformly participate. Okay, I will now move on to Reichenbach and to the fact that several commentators, including Reichmann, Richardson, but especially Flavia Padovani, have pointed out at least indirect, but possibly also direct influence by Cassirer on Reichenbach's account of coordination in his early writing, starting from his doctoral thesis. Actually, it is also known that Reichenbach asked Paul Nathorp, another Marburg-Neo-Kantian, to become his supervisor, and then was refused. So he turned to Paul Hansen and Max Noether as replacement. It is also known that before that he attended Cassirer classes in Berlin. So we are in 1913, 1914. However, the habilitation thesis where he proposes a further version of relativized a priori is largely written on his own, and I will also stress that there are points of departure from this Marburg-Neo-Kantian background already in this work concerning precisely the notion of necessity of the a priori. So Reichenbach proposed this further relativization, starting from a distinction that Reichenbach borrowed from Schlick between two different kinds of coordination: a mathematical type of coordination where the two sides are defined axiomatically. Examples of what Cassirer called coordinations in my previous slides, such as the coordination between the points of a line and the rational numbers, would fall into this category. And on the other hand, physical coordination, which is between one mathematical side that is also conceptually defined, and another side that corresponds to physical reality, and it is initially taken as undefined because it is defined in and through coordination, or as Reichenbach also says, it is constituted. And famously, Reichenbach provided a new account of the Kantian a priori that partly overlaps with Cohen's distinction between metaphysical and transcendental, saying that Kant's a priori had two different meanings in the original version, as necessarily true and valid for all time on the one hand, and as constituting the concept of an object on the other. And whereas Cassirer's strategy to account for the change of a priori elements in relativistic physics exploits the relative necessity of the Kantian a priori, Reichenbach thought that the first of the above meaning was completely disproved by general relativity, but the second could be retained with regard to the principles that in physical theories coordinate abstract mathematical structures with physical realities. This is can vary from theory to theory, but Reichenbach also points to some of these principles that do not vary, but remain constant even in these other variations. So this typically includes the principle of probability or Gen identity, which he takes to be constant, but the example of geometry is the typical example of a principle that has to be changed from pre-relativistic theories to general relativity, in order to have this coordination between the new structure of physics and physical reality. And the main difference with the neo-Kantians is that Reichenbach seems to abandon the idea of necessity altogether, so he doesn't even need a relative necessity. As it is clear from his account of what he calls the contribution of reason to experience. So he writes, it is not possible, as Kant believed, to single out the concept of object, in the concept of object, a component that reason regards as necessary. It is experience that decides which elements are necessary. The idea that the concept of object has its origin in reason can manifest itself only in the fact that this concept contains elements for which no selection is prescribed, that is, elements that are independent of the nature of reality. The arbitrariness of these elements shows that they owe their occurrence in the concept of knowledge altogether to reason. So there is really here a different turn in the understanding of the features of constitutive elements, to the point that some of the directions in the contemporary debate that take off from Reichenbach, in particular Stamp, focus on the notion of constitutive elements and propose to dispense, do without a priori altogether, because there is lacking any commitment as to necessity. And I will now slowly introduce the objections that lead to reconsider this relativization. by referring to the debate that followed the publication of Reichenbach's work on relativity and Cassirer's book on general relativity in the early 1920s. So in this debate, Schlick famously reviewed both books in Kant Studien, so one of the main outlets for the Neo-Kantian movement, arguing that they were inconsistent with Kant's own theory of the a priori and partly trivial insofar as relativized a priori principles are best understood as conventions that play a constitutive role in science. And famously, Schlick, in a letter exchange that followed this paper, convinced Reichenbach to adopt his terminology and to abandon any notion of a priori in a modified Kant sense in favor of a form of conventionalism that, of course, is still compatible with Reichenbach's empiricism, but even at least terminologically points to a different view. So the first question is whether there can be a non-trivial characterization of relativized a priori, at least in Cassirer's sense, so a characterization that does not collapse with conventionalism. And I wanted to point to a possible way to mark this distinction that emerges very clearly from a paper by Jeremy Heiss from 2014, where Jeremy Heiss says, well, there are some regulative features of Cassirer's a priori that prevent his principles from being relabeled as conventions. And these features he summarizes in the following. A priori principles can be identified only through an analysis of our current best scientific theorizing. Our current theories do not fulfill completely the ideal that a physical theory cover a wide range of phenomena using the simplest resources possible. And while space and time are a priori in Cassirer's sense, we can be mistaken about their nature. So insofar as Cassirer introduces these regulative features of the a priori, he articulates the view of constitutive a priori further in a way that does not need to turn to conventionalism. However, this view is exposed to other kinds of objections, in particular whether it still remains consistent in so combining regulative features with constitutive ones. One could also rephrase this second kind of objections under the label relativism, because it is the implication of what Schlick took to be an inconsistent reading of Kant, insofar as Schlick believed that Cassirer and Marburg Neo-Kantians more generally had prevented any possible account of experiencing Kant's sense by demolishing what Kant took to be the mediating term or the bridge between thought and reality, namely pure intuitions. This seemed to make the connection between thought and reality impossible, and so to prevent any notion of scientific objectivity. Taking up this line of criticism, Friedman, already in the book on logical empiricism, argued that Cassirer took a direction that would eventually lead him to a form of relativism expressed in the philosophy of symbolic forms, in Cassirer's assumption that the objectivity of science is not unique, is not the only type of objectivity, but is to be taught in connection with a whole system of forms in which the relation between the I and the world is shaped differently, and where objectivity is also accordingly constituted differently and from different sides. This would open the way to a type of relativism. And the way also Friedman later phrased this kind of objection is that in order to have a consistent combination of these regulative features with the constitutive ones, one would have to reduce the constitutive a priori to regulative principles, and so to reduce the kind of continuity between one theory and another in scientific change, to a kind of inclusion of the structure of an older theory into a larger structure that is providing a sort of limiting case of a structure of the world. The problem is that, starting from this view, philosophers don't have much to say as to the direction that science takes in practice, but they can only make, Friedman says, an educated guess as to the convergence of constitutive changing principles of historical theories towards an ideal of all-encompassing mathematical structure. I will come to the last line of criticism, which I take to be the most challenging, and is related to this previous one, to this last claim by Friedman, namely that of irrelevance. This actually goes back to not to Schlick's line of argument, but to the way in which Einstein dismissed Cassirer's relativizing strategies in a review of a book by another neo-Kantian who tried to develop an argument as to the consistency of the Kantian account of experience with general relativity. And in the end, Einstein also attacked more generally all these attempts at a reform of the notion or a revision, or however they phrased it, saying what remains unsatisfactory in this is always the arbitrariness of the choice of these elements, of those elements that one designates as a priori, entirely apart from the fact that the theory could one day be replaced by another that replaces certain of these elements by others. So what philosophers will do then will be just to change the language and follow a direction that they already find in science. And the same consequence corresponds in Friedman's line of critique to the observation that in Cassirer's account, the mathematical derivation of all the theories would be available only in retrospect, so from the point of view of the final theory, but it would be insufficient to account for scientific change in the making, so from a more internal perspective. More harshly, Stamp's conclusion when confronted with Cassirer and this line of criticism is that what we actually use in science is our current understanding of concepts, not what the concepts really are in some Platonic heaven or what they will be at the hypothetical end of inquiry. So it doesn't help in any way to have this notion of invariance towards which regulatively all the changing a priori converge, but because it has nothing to say about scientific practice, the way that concepts change in scientific practice itself. And as I said, Stamp's solution is then inspired by a pragmatic notion of a priori, but shares with Reichenbach's the idea of leaving out completely necessity and using the idea of constitutive a priori as a local notion that can apply on a case-by-case basis to scientific practice at hand. So to conclude, I would like to point out some alternative lines of argument, but as I said, I would like to also leave it a bit open for discussion to reply to some of these objections. So I already mentioned that the problem with triviality is whether the notion of the relativized a priori offers a genuine alternative to conventionalism, especially in the case of geometry in physics. So that is the critical point. But more generally, when it comes to show some sort of co-evolution of mathematics and physics, where mathematics is not taken to be somehow finished, complete, defined, as Reichenbach says, but to require further elaboration as a response to what comes from the lower levels of inquiry. Here, I think that Cassirer's idea of a functional system where levels are interrelated has resources that still need to be exploited to show how the directions of this concept formation are not determined only from above, but in a way also bottom up. But this holds for Reichenbach himself to a certain extent, as is shown by accounts of his theory of measurement by Padovani and other, with the difference, of course, that eventually Reichenbach took a version of conventionalism as a better option with respect to the relativized a priori. When it comes to the notion or the problem of relativism, there is a strategy that Heiss and others have identified as a two-tier conception that fits quite well both with Cassirer and Reichenbach's in a way, insofar as they both seem to admit elements that remain constant from theory to theory, together with elements that vary from one theory to another. In particular, Heiss has proposed a somewhat comprehensive taxonomy of how these elements look like, in a way that is definitely consistent with what Cassirer says at different stages of his career about mathematical concepts theory-specific categories, ultimate invariants, and so on. And this would amount as a line of reply to the relativism objection to show that relativism is blocked insofar as some elements remain as absolute, as Heiss called them. So only some are relativized, whereas some remain absolute and constant. And what I would add to that is that this helps definitely with the first two kinds of objection, triviality as well as relativism, because we have a way to clearly separate these regulative features from conventionalism. We also have an argument that is countering relativistic type of objections. It is less effective, I think, with respect to the problem of irrelevance, insofar as here clearly we don't have an explanation of the line of argument at work when Cassirer says we can reverse the order of concept. We can come up with different principles and different concepts insofar as it is the manifold of experience, the problems of measurements that require that. This is somewhat missing from this taxonomy. And so my final suggestion would be to look at the pragmatic development of the notion, but more specifically, I would like to conclude with some remarks from a paper by Arthur Papp in a transitional phase of his career, where he is still quite influenced by Cassirer, as is probably well known. Arthur Papp was Cassirer's student at Yale, and he later graduated in 1947, so after Cassirer's death, at Columbia with Ernst Nagel. From the work that has been done by Stamp and others, it emerged how his view changed significantly in this time frame. There is also a version of the doctoral thesis that Papp drafted before the final version, more influenced by Nagel, that would show his reliance on Cassirer more clearly, but also the departure as his view is clarified later. I will leave out for today the issue whether one can read his synthesis as a sort of syncretic attempt to mediate between different traditions, or perhaps an interesting place where continental and analytic traditions find dialogue. I will just point to how in this very early article, which is from 1944, he presents the matter of differentiating the different kinds of a priori. And we find a distinction that corresponds to Cassirer's strategy of a functionalization of the a priori, explained as follows. So there is, according to Papp, a formal notion of a priori, which is the same as analytic or logical necessity derived from self-contradictoriness of the contradictory. A material notion of it that is related to a psychological notion of necessity, namely the inconceivability of the opposite, truth in a non-pragmatic sense that possess some kind of evidence independently of the use that we make of them. And finally, there is a notion of functional a priori that bears what he calls hypothetical necessity. And this is a characteristic of methodological postulates or leading principles of science whose goal is to prescribe a method. And Papp's line of argument is, with reference to Cohen's reading of Kant, to identify the transcendental logic as the investigation of the process of non-inductive synthesis that renders possible analysis. He points out that any synthetic sentence in this sense, whether empirical or eidetic, may be made by a conventional act into analytic, formally a priori sentence, but it is usually made formally a priori in order to be taken as functionally a priori. So it allows for shifting from one level to another, but with this functionality in the trajectory. As methodological postulates, the functional a priori are open to revision by experience, although only indirectly, that is, by failure of the empirical laws that gave rise to them to be verified, as he puts it. Whether a hypothesis functions as a priori or not depends on the degree of its generality. This is the systematization that Papp proposes, which interests me because there is, apart from the specific argument that Papp brings for the revisability, so the failure of empirical laws to be verified, that is definitely an addition that is not in Cassirer's text, but what actually is quite close to Cassirer's line of argument, I think, is firstly the idea of a relative notion of necessity, and secondly the possibility to look at this transition from one level to another as the key to a relativized notion of a priori. So again, I don't have such strong conclusions, but I list them very briefly. Cassirer, throughout his intellectual career, accounts for constitution of objectivity in terms of distinct but interconnected levels of synthesis. We saw that this culminates in his taxonomy of the statements of physics in the book on quantum mechanics. But the key, what keeps these different accounts together, I think, is really the idea of functionality itself. And cases such as non-Euclidean geometry in general relativity show that the order of concepts, even at the highest levels, cannot be fixed once and for all, but may be reversed to meet the demands coming from the lower level. And this is the point where I think pointing at something absolute in his account of a priori is misguided somehow. What matters most to Cassirer's thesis is the ability of science to anticipate experience by constructing it as a structured whole. So precisely the supposed shortcoming to be Whiggish, to be also a merely formal account of continuity in theory change is also misguided, I think, because really what matters most to Cassirer's different rephrasal of the idea is this construction of experience. And this relies on the idea that he first considered in mathematical procedures alone of serial principles making up structures. This can be also taken as indication of how the argument goes in physics. These are my references, and thank you very much in advance for your comments.
Thank you, Professor Biagioli, for a very nice talk. So now we have a comment by Professor Ernst and a Q&A session.
Morning, Professor Biagioli. It's an honor and a pleasure here commenting on your talk. I've read your book on number and geometry and learned a lot from it. My comments, maybe some moments in my comments are already answered in your talk, because I think I received an earlier version of your paper. I don't have the references to Park or Heinz, so maybe some things are already answered. But I will present what I have prepared. As per usual, my remarks are not intended to debate Professor Biagioli's presentation, but rather to make some comments and ask for some clarifications in order to broaden the context of the discussion and to spark the conversation for the subsequent Q&A. I want to start by remarking that for a strict Kantian, the expression relative necessity of the Kantian a priori inevitably has a paradoxical ring, since if we are talking of the Kantian a priori, its necessity must be apothetical, not relative. Of course, this means in Reichenbach or in Karman and Friedman, for instance, that the a priori that we are dealing here with corresponds, as pointed out, to what Cohen calls the transcendental a priori, or a priori as that which constitutes the concept of the object. So maybe we should talk rather of a neo-Kantian a priori when dealing with this new approach to the a priori. And although in the beginning of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant identifies strict universality and necessity as the mark of the a priori, this sense is reserved in the logical positivist, or since we are talking about a period prior to the constitution of the Vienna Circle, what we can call Viennese scientific philosophy. In this movement, this sense is reserved to analytical proposition, that is, just to logic and mathematics, pure mathematics. But, of course, the interesting a priori is the one associated with the idea of synthetic or ampliative, informative, and non-trivial or only logical a priori. Let's remember that one strategy to obtain a non-trivial a priori is the Fregean one. We define analyticity not as a property of some judgment or proposition, but as a property of any proposition, or strictly speaking again, of any theorem derived from axioms and definitions of a sound logical axiomatic system, like the conceptography or predicate calculus. This left Frege with the uncomfortable option of assuming that this a priori could not account for geometry, which is still explained in the jargon of the synthetic a priori in Frege. I believe that the Fregean option could be understood if we remember that a priori has many meanings, even in Kant. Not only different meanings, but it applies to different things. Even when disregarding the analytical a priori, when we consider its synthetic counterpart, we must distinguish at least two different applications of the terms. First, to intuitions and concepts, or categories, and then to principles. The first case is the a priori that is constitutive of our general experience, what Kant calls possible experience. That is, the Kantian concept of possible experience must be distinguished from the neo-Kantian concept of experience that corresponds to the scientific picture of the world. The first case is then this constitutive of our general experience, our possible experience, while the second case is constitutive of our best physical and mathematical science, and also other domains that do not interest us here as the moral realm of reason. The first one is exemplified in the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental deduction of the first critique, while the second case is exemplified in the metaphysical principles of the science of nature and in the opus postum, for instance. Just to make clear, a priori in Kant sometimes refers to intuition and concept, but refers also to principles. And what is interesting for the neo-Kantians is the a priori of principles. Friedman is an illustrative case of this, since he goes back to the metaphysical principles of natural science as revealing, let's say, the real import of the a priori constitutiveness in Kant. I'm saying this to point that Cassirer, Reichenbach, and in general, any proposal of relative a priori focus on the second case, principles, while not considering the first one. And this is relevant because before Cassirer or Reichenbach, we see attempts to historically revise and relativize the a priori as applied to intuitions and concepts, especially in French, in 19th century French philosophy that I'm currently working more with. For instance, some examples of this. Our first attempt of this kind, already in the 1850s, is due to Augustin Cournot, one of the first philosophers of science to point out the probabilistic nature of natural knowledge. For him, the probabilistic regularities of our physical experience can, in the long run, constitute a framing device of all phenomena, like and as if de facto substitute for a priori categories. Another interesting attempt in this sense was made in the context of Charles Renouvier neocriticism or critical idealism. For him, Renouvier, the categories in which the Kantian intuitions of space and time are now subsumed as discursive concepts. There are not a priori intuitions in Renouvier, they are all categories. The categories, although necessary, are to be found as a final result of our best scientific theories. The different tables of categories of Aristotle, Kant, or Hegel are historical approximations that depend on the science of their days. Renouvier, of course, like a good 19th century philosopher, sees contemporary science as the definitive correct, 19th century science, as a definitive correct explanation of the universe. And this means that now we can complete and set once and for all a core table of category, his own. But it's a historical process of determining categories. They are not only constitutive of all science, but also revealed and refined through science. Of course, I'm here overlooking some details of Renouvier position to focus on the similarity of the goals, although not of the strategies. Renouvier's writings were influential in French conventionalism, conceived as a response, but also in many treatments of the constitutive conditions of the human, or Geistwissenschaft. We have a thread that goes back from Renouvier to, for instance, Durkheim, that works famously with what he calls social categories that are analogous to the categories that play a role in science. But in the case of Durkheim, they play that role in social science. In contrary, the German tradition, of course, the tradition of Reichenbach and Cassirer, went in an opposite direction, almost exclusively focusing on a priori principles as constitutive of science. So my first question will be how to understand this difference in this historical development. Surely, the answer must pass through the Cohenian and, in general, Marburgian reading of Kant. As the title of Cohen's work showed, he thinks science through principle, the principle of the infinitesimal, but also in an historical key. It's the principle of the infinitesimal in its historical level. My second point comes from this first one. It seems that Reichenbach is trying to do something different from Cassirer in this sense. Cassirer can relativize the a priori because he historicizes the a priori. Reichenbach wants to achieve this relativization of the a priori without historicization of the a priori. Where Cassirer's a priori is the result of paying attention to the history of science, Reichenbach seems to be obtained precisely by ignoring history, as we pointed out, both by abandoning the idea of necessity altogether when introducing both arbitrary elements in the system. As important as pointing out the similarities between Cassirer and Reichenbach, I think we must also emphasize, maybe more importantly, the difference. There is, for instance, let me just briefly quote here, a passage of a letter from Cassirer from 1920, from Cassirer to Reichenbach, where he says, "Our points of view show a certain affinity, but insofar I can see they diverge, even in what regards the concept of a priori, as well as the interpretation of Kant's theory, which, in my opinion, you assume to be too psychologically oriented, and therefore you put it in a very excessive opposition to ours, in quote, to your own, in quote, scientific, analytical, close quotes, consideration. If we understand Kant in a rigorous, transcendental sense, we can see that he is more close indeed to this later conception than you, I cannot admit, may admit." End of quote, citation. And I would like also to make more freely a remark that comes from my reading of Friedman. I spoke here on Monday about Friedman, the dynamics of reason and the Friedmanian project. And one thing that one difficulty we have with Friedman is that although Friedman rejects any kind of holism in the Quinian sense, he still works with the idea that there are some propositions, a priori principles that are at the core of our web of beliefs. And the empirical facts that are in the periphery of our web of beliefs, for Friedman, they are made possible. They only have sense because of the constitutivity of the center, of the core of our web of belief. But this is not necessarily so. There is a sense, for instance, the one we find in Van Fraassen reading of the history of science, where the core can be defined after we have achieved a reasonable development of some science. In Friedman, the a priori must has a role in explaining also, as you pointed out in the paper in some moment, the possibility of revolutions in science. A change in constitutive principles allows a change in normal science after a revolution. But the objection, I think, is similar to the objection Schlick poses to Reichenbach, is that we don't have to work with the a priori notion. We don't have to bother with it. We can do without it in some sense. We can just think, for instance, to speaking about constitutive or about conceptual frameworks, or if you consider current philosophy of science, speak in terms of models and its correlations to empirical structures of facts to represent reality. We also have here a kind of coordination between structure and facts and empirical facts, but it's not an a priori one. And an argument, a strong argument, must be made to for this coordination to be an a priori one. And finally, I would like to finish my comments with an observation that fits Cassirer, Reichenbach, but mainly Friedman, because he himself assumes this project in the second part of the dynamic of reason. In Cassirer, in Reichenbach, and in general, with all the philosophers that try to really take some kind of a priori in the 20th century, there's an assumption that the real science, the core of the sciences, are physics and mathematics. But if we are to have a function for the idea of a relativized a priori, this relativized a priori must, in some sense, be able to account also for other sciences. For instance, chemistry, a case, or electromagnetism, two cases that Friedman tries to fit in his model, but also for biology, for instance. In the case of Cassirer, it's curious that in his last writings, the writings of his American period, right before he dies, he tries to do this, to apply a kind of relativized a priori to linguistics, for instance, in his papers, Structuralism and Linguistics. And this is also something that I think must be taken into account if we are to defend or some kind of relativized a priori. Those were my comments. I hope that they can spark some conversation with Professor Biagioli and also in the subsequent question and answer sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How should we proceed? Should I go through some of the points, or should we collect the comments first?
No, you can reply to Ernesto, and then we open up for the Q&A session.
Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot. That was very interesting, very helpful, and indeed, I rethought a bit the final part to make it more suitable for discussion, I guess. So sorry for not sending you an updated draft on that part. You are perfectly right, but your comments were very pertinent. So hopefully it worked out. So as for your the first comments, I noted a few things, but actually they are very rich, and I hope you will send them to me. Some of the things that you said about the comparison with Kant and with other usage of the term, for example, by Frege, I perfectly agree. They would deserve to be spelled out a bit. My first part is a bit sketchy on this. But very roughly, as for Kant's notion of a priori, I think you are right that there is a tendency to focus on principles rather than other elements that are a priori in Kant's sense. However, I think that Cohen, one can agree or not, of course, but has quite a detailed account of how he supports his reading about the priority of the transcendental that does not take exactly the same direction as Friedman's and others. So, in fact, Cohen pays very little attention to the metaphysical foundation of natural science and that usage of principles, but what interests him most are the principles of the synthetic principles in the Critique of Reason. He thinks that even in the genesis of the critical philosophy, the idea of these principles is the key to the whole system, and maybe some of details about how the system looks like. Famously, Cohen gives up the distinction between forms of intuition and categories, so something quite substantial. But he believes that it is all justified if the main insight is coming from the idea of the synthetic principles as what keeps together the whole enterprise of investigating the conditions of experience into a system where there can be different elements, but they all relate together in the end. So he verticalizes the reading on the principles in the sense of the synthetic principles, but I'm not sure that this immediately leads to the principles of physics. The connection is probably more via his understanding of the method as based on the fact of science and inspired by the prolegomena. But the metaphysical foundations of natural science is really not probably his main reference, also because the connection Kant-Newton is quite twofold for Cohen. On the one hand, well, it shows that Kant was a Newtonian, that's his notion of experience, Newtonian science. On the other hand, Kant's reliance on Newton exposes him to a series of objections, so Cohen is not always happy to point out this Newtonian heritage. It's a view that at least should be differentiated from Friedman's neo-Kantianism, I would say, and it has some basics on Kant philology that are quite strong. In particular, that passage about the contingency of experience is also a passage that Cohen takes really from Kant. So having said that, there is no question about the fact that for Kant, synthetic a priori knowledge can be apodictic, which in the end, in Cohen's reading, is dispensable. So perhaps your suggestion to talk about a neo-Kantian notion of a priori is perfectly in place. It is not the same as Frege's and others' usage of the analytic synthetic distinction. That part concerns my remarks about Cassirer's appropriation of logicism. Well, Cassirer is also aware that they use analytic in a different sense there, so he's not committed to showing that they are not that some mathematical kind of reasonings are not analytic in that sense. Actually, Cassirer takes the usage more in line with the consequences of the Cohenian reading of Kant, and so it ends up being synthetic a priori, all that allows construction of experience, including at the very abstract logico-mathematical level, the construction, the determination of mathematical types of objectivity. So that is for Cassirer something that the philosopher would call synthetic, despite the fact that the mathematician calls this derivation analytic or not. So he would just say, okay, you're using the distinction in a different way. About your other point, so the difference between Cassirer and Reichenbach, you are perfectly right. They go in different directions. In fact, I don't want to push the analogy too far. About the historicity of the perspective, though, I wanted to stress one thing that is not so much in the presentation, but that I considered, is that Reichenbach is quite in line with the strategy that Cohen and other neo-Kantians call transcendental method. He's quite aware of it, and he calls it analysis of science, and also refers to the prolegomena. So these are all references that are common. But on the other hand, Reichenbach, when he talks about the a priori makeup of reason and other Kantian notion, as Cassirer points in that letter, is based on a different reading of Kant. If one would want to really dig into where this reading is coming from, by 1920, it's probably relating to Reichenbach's exchanges with the so-called Neo-Frisian brand of Neo-Kantianism that is typically on a completely different side with respect to the psychologism debate. So there you're perfectly right. They push to different directions. In fact, they do presuppose different readings of Kant. And finally, well, the objections that you mentioned, of course, they are the most difficult. So to the first one that relates maybe more also to the discussion that I started at the end, why bother with a priori arguments, a priori elements? Isn't it just a burden that we can do without? Of course, if one is interested in constitutivity in some on a case-by-case level, on a case-by-case basis, the objection meets the goal very easily. So why bother? And it's simpler to just study constitutivity. In fact, that was Stump's proposal. In my references is Stump's proposal, who says, well, we don't really need to deal with this whole other commitments. We can just stick to constitutivity and investigate actually the most different elements. They can be empirical elements, they can be model, they play a constitutive role, and we can reconstruct this role. The problem with that, what makes Friedman not satisfied with that, and I think Neo-Kantians, they share this worry, is that in this way, as you also pointed out, the whole enterprise becomes really only retrospective. So the job is to look at scientific theories and clarify, investigate what are these constitutive elements in some specific cases, but this doesn't tell us anything about the way scientific concepts evolve in something that can display some overarching notion of rationality. So what interests Friedman is to have a justification of the rationality of theory change more in the whole, so a more general argument for it that would counter the post-Kuhnian kind of issues deriving from incommensurability. And of course, this is a different, this is a difficult problem to handle. So the idea of introducing relativized a priori there is maybe part of an answer for Friedman. Actually, he thinks it is the beginning of a possible strategy. Then he turns to a different account of rationality inspired by Kant philosophy, but definitely also borrowing from different traditions than Neo-Kantianism, strictly speaking. So to make it short, it's a very broad issue. And as for the motivation, again, it is a motivation depending also on the on the stance that one takes towards this post-Kuhnian problematic. So it's a very big issue, I guess. The final remark that you made is also very interesting. So why do they focus only on physics, mathematics? Why do they leave out entire sectors of knowledge? Of course, this wouldn't apply to Cassirer. Cassirer was very versatile and very into many different fields. So he wrote extensively also about the development of the other sciences that you mentioned, including linguistic. But again, this broadness of his perspective has been charged with leaving room for relativism. So some take it to be problematic, some not. I agree with you that is definitely an interesting feature of his understanding of a priori. A point that I would like to make in this discussion, even though I let it a little bit not so explicit today, is that when they talk about relativized a priori in connection to mathematical physics, they focus not really on mathematics, but on physics. So one aspect that gets to be completely disregarded sometimes is that Cassirer is also very careful to observe how mathematics also evolves. Is not just providing some abstract possibilities from which physics measurement makes a selection in a sort of a historical way. No, mathematics has also concept formation and everything, and so it deserves a whole account of a prioricity in itself. So there already if you restrict the discussion about coordination to mathematics and physics, you see that Cassirer has a more complex account of objectivity and object constitution that includes the objectivity of mathematics as a problematic to be considered on its own in its own right. Whereas often in this discussion, mathematics is only there as an abstract theory, and this is shown, I think, very clearly also in the line of objection that we've seen by Friedman and others, when they think that Cassirer's view amounts to formally reconstruct continuity at the level of mathematical structure. But this really does not square with all that Cassirer says about the concept formation in mathematics and its historical dimension. So, yeah, that's more or less what I wrote down. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will send you my remarks, and I hope we can continue this discussion in the future. I will leave room for the question and answer of the
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
So we are now open for questions. So if nobody wants to pose a question, so then I just want to actually ask a clarification question. So when does it exactly Schlick poses his objection to Reichenbach about the relative a priori?
Well, Schlick wrote an essay in 1921, empiricist versus criticist interpretations of modern physics, where he addressed the objections that he thought would meet both Cassirer and Reichenbach's interpretation. And then there are private exchanges, both with Reichenbach and with Cassirer. So I don't know if that was here. This one? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is.
I think it's in this triviality. Yeah.
All right. No. Okay. This is more found. Is found more in detail in the essay. This essay about the interpretations of modern physics, whereas the suggestion really to just change terminology, because in fact there is no substantial difference between what Reichenbach called a prioris and conventions, is more in the private exchange with Reichenbach, which was immediately after.
Okay, and in this correspondence, I wonder, do they address at all, like, what does coordination actually means? Because it seems to me that in all those cases, coordinations are very relevant for explaining how to interpret an axiomatic system. And Schlick was very, so, coordinative definition was his most important definition up until the Aufbau, so then he changes his mind because of Carnot. And I wonder if there is an exchange with Reichenbach on the actual content of coordinations, but because it seems to be defined in a little bit slightly different way.
Well, I think that actually Reichenbach's definition is quite in line with Schlick's. Here, when he points to the fact that mathematical coordination is different from physical. And in mathematics allows for what Schlick called implicit definitions. So definitions that also can be called axiomatic or where you have something defined by a system of relation. In the case of geometry, that would be, for example, the primitives, what you call line, point in Hilbert's axiomatics amount to the way in which these primitives, you can call however you like, are related to each other as established by a set of by groups of axioms. And this suffices in mathematics to have definitions. This is the point that also Schlick stresses. But in physics, things are more complicated because one side of the coordination is a mathematical structure with these characteristics, and the other side is undefined. So the problem is to establish coordination in a way that physical reality gets to be defined in analogy with implicit definitions in mathematics. And the notion, I think, is not so innocent, it is not so unproblematic of implicit definitions, but if your question concerns what is Reichenbach's background, I think it's very much relating to Schlick's understanding of coordination. And I would also add, it's not the same as Cassirer's, because Cassirer, if you look at the examples in substance and function, takes the idea to be really that coordination helps introducing the new numbers, introducing the new coordinates, knowing about the new geometry in mathematics. So also has this heuristic function in mathematics. And it tends to have the same function in physics. So there is not really a principal difference as Reichenbach sketches it between the two types of coordination. Taking the very same example, because Reichenbach takes the same example as Cassirer, so the coordination of the points on a line and the rational numbers, Reichenbach said, well, all these things are defined by themselves axiomatically, whereas Cassirer here is following more literally Dedekind's reasoning to the effect that the new numbers are being created as new individuals with a mathematical ontology that Reichenbach is clearly not considering in the same term.
Okay, no, thanks. Yeah, I was thinking about it, but that works. So does anyone have further questions? So yeah, we have no more questions then. I would like to thank you, Professor Francesca Biagioli. It was very nice, very interesting talk, and I hope we can meet in person eventually.
Me too. Thanks again.
That was great.
Thank you.
Não, ainda não. Acho que agora ela saiu. Não. Vou fechar aqui, né?